Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Book at Lunchtime event where we're going to be discussing the recently published Great Zimbabwe, Reclaiming a Confiscated Past by Shadrach Chirikure. My name is Maria Blanco, and I'm the Torch Academic Champion, so welcome to all of you. It's a really great pleasure to be here to introduce the second Book at Lunchtime of this term. As regulars of this series will know, the Book at Lunchtime is Torch's flagship event series that takes the form of fortnightly, bite-sized book discussions with a range of commentators. So I've just wanted to invite everyone to take a look at our website and our newsletter where we have information about forthcoming events. My main task is a small one today. I'm going to thank you all for coming and to say how pleased we are to have the author of Great Zimbabwe, Professor Shadrach Chirikure, with us today, as well as Professor William Barnard, both of whom will be introduced in a little more detail by our chair, Jocelyn Alexander. So before I move into the audience and I join you, I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about our chair. Professor Jocelyn Alexander is Professor of Commonwealth Studies at the University of Oxford. Her research concerns the social and political history of Southern Africa and currently focuses on liberation movement, military cultures, and political imprisonment. Jocelyn is the author of The Unsettled Land, The Politics of Land and State-Making in Zimbabwe, 1893 to 2003, and Violence and Memory, 100 Years in the Dark Forest of Matabeleland, which she authored with Joanne McGregor and Terence Ranger. She sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Southern African Studies and the Publications Committee of the International Africa Institute. So it's very hard to think of a better guide to today's discussions, and I'll hand over to Jocelyn now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation to this event and the event itself, which I think is going to be really fascinating for everybody. So I'm going to ask Professor Chirikure to speak for 5 minutes, but I'm first going to introduce him very briefly. He came to us via the University of Cape Town, where he's head of the Department of Archaeology and director of the Archaeological Materials Laboratory, among many other things. But he has, for the last few years, been a British Academy Global Professor here in Oxford. And I think we are extraordinarily lucky that we're going to be able to keep him, as he's recently been appointed the Edward Hall Professor of Archaeological Science here in Oxford, which is something to celebrate and really great news. So he is, in his own words, an archaeological scientist who tackles questions related to human material relations through time. He addresses these questions using materials from archaeological sites and remains of contemporary consumption practices. He engages with the politics of knowledge production to develop a comparative understanding of the knowledge, skill, and ownership informed by Global South epistemologies and philosophy of science. He is the author of course, the book we're going to discuss today, Great Zimbabwe, Reclaiming a Confiscated Past. So I will hand over to him for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. So very nice to see you all. But I'm not so sure how much I can say in 5 minutes. Maybe the first thing that I can say is that I'm sure some of you in the audience have at some point, just left home, just going in any direction, without a purpose, and then hope that at some point you might you might find a purpose, That's what happened with this book, It is a thought, a product of a thought experiment. When I started, I was not so sure what I was doing, but I was hoping that maybe at the end I will say something sensible. Right. But the major impetus to the book came as a result of a documentary that I participated in. So there is a crew from France and Germany. They said that they had read some of the papers that I had written on Great Zimbabwe. And then they said that, well, we would like to do a documentary using your work. So at the end of that documentary, then I said, but hang on, I can actually turn this into a book. So that's how it all started. But at the heart of all was the need to say, on the one hand, I also joined the decolonial bandwagon. So let's decolonize, Great Zimbabwe, let's decolonize African history, let's decolonize African archaeology, which is also quite interesting because most of the work that I do is in the lab, actually, and I apply the principles of chemistry and physics on materials to tell stories. So someone at Duke University challenged me and said, "You have used the word decolonial so many times, but how do you achieve that in practice?" So I said, "Well, let me try that with Great Zimbabwe." And so that's why it is why this book is an experiment. So far, it's about 5 or 6 book reviews, and the reviewers are also saying some very interesting things, some of which I never really thought about because it was an experiment, and it is an experiment, and it's also just a year since the book was published in hardbook, and at the end of May, that will be in paperback. So it is doing quite well. But the key thing then is that using my experience growing up in a village in rural Zimbabwe, doing things from the point of view of the village, can I translate that experience into being an archaeologist and into being also an archaeological scientist, and then look back into the village to say, this is how I might interpret a Great Zimbabwe. So that's what this book is all about. It's just an experiment in trying to say, if I were imagining or reimagining Great Zimbabwe from the point of view of being located in the village, what can I say? And how can I have a conversation with colleagues such as you guys? Which is why we are here, I guess.
Absolutely. Thank you. Perfect. And perfectly 5 minutes as well. I love thinking about the book as an experiment. I think it comes across as highly kind of innovative and creative. So that's a good way to think about it. Professor Chirikure's book is a magnificent one. And it sets out to reclaim, in his words, the place known as Great Zimbabwe. And I assume everyone here is familiar with the site of Great Zimbabwe. As he notes, it's many things: a collection of abandoned settlements, a spectacular stone structure, a shrine, an archaeological site, a historical state capital and territory, a recent and current national monument, a World Heritage Site. It has to be reclaimed because it was, as he puts it, confiscated from the historical and more recent inhabitants of this region by European explorers, settlers, and archaeologists, who at first denied that Africans could have constructed its extraordinary stone walls, attributing it to a host of outside settlers who echoed themselves in bringing a higher form of civilization to this place. This theory of exotic origin reinforced a racist dismissal of local knowledge about the site, while archaeological science, even after the local origins of Great Zimbabwe were accepted, meant that the site was literally fenced off from and rendered inaccessible to local people. As in so many similar sites, many objects were removed in a quite literal confiscation too. Some are famously here in Oxford. This alienation via the disciplinary practices of archaeology did not end with Zimbabwe's independence. Instead, the language, concepts, and narratives of archaeological work remained esoteric and foreign, while the questions posed about the history of Great Zimbabwe remained narrowly confined. Professor Chirikure's project of reclamation is an extremely ambitious one, and it reflects who he is, as you've just been saying. He is an archaeologist, of course, and knows well the value and capabilities of the discipline, but he's also from this region, and his own knowledge of Great Zimbabwe is framed by his experience of the social relations, environment, and language of this place. And that's visible, it comes out in various passages in the books. in the book, this is what he calls experiential knowledge. In this book, he has sought to combine the two, that is, to retain the methods of archaeology alongside local understandings of Great Zimbabwe. His goal is to produce what he calls at various points relatable, understandable, locally acceptable, usable, or relevant versions of the past, rooted in local ways of knowing. That is, he's creating a practice of decolonizing knowledge about Great Zimbabwe that can accommodate different modes of knowledge production at one and the same time. He wants to thereby confront extractive practices that rendered Great Zimbabwe legible to distant audiences while ignoring local sensibilities and values. So he rejects a scientific expert monopoly on interpretation and narrative and introduces what he calls native ontologies, not as sources or as somehow inferior or subordinate to scientific knowledge, but as forms of knowledge that can produce new interpretations in conversation with archaeological ways of knowing. There is a tremendous passion in this argument throughout the book, and it's applied to a host of different questions, from chronology to state-making and urbanism, to relations with the environment, to labor, production, and trade, to religion and political ideology. Striking new interpretations won from this approach are the result. Professor Thierry Curry is not over-reclaiming in this book. He constantly reiterates the tenuousness of knowledge about the distant past, the extent of speculation and guesswork, notably in the what he calls the ethnographic analogy, which I think must be an archaeological thing. And this is partly the point about specifically archaeological knowledge, that its very tenuousness has meant that multiple interpretations can be made of it, rendering it politically highly malleable. Much of the emphasis in the book is precisely about this element of the politics of knowledge production in archaeological work. So I know I'm close to the end of my time already, so I'm going to raise some further questions, maybe not exactly in your comfort zone, about the politics of knowledge production. I'm going to try and provoke you a little bit, that partly flow from my own disciplinary position as an oral historian who focuses on much more recent political history in Zimbabwe. So the knowledge that's referred to in the book as local or native, whether in the past or the present, raises questions for me about power relations and the politics of representation. In places, I wondered who exactly was representing the local, who was the source of this knowledge, and what the consequences were of, inevitably, of course, privileging some views over others. Figures such as chiefs or spirit mediums, as you, of course, acknowledge, are political figures, and their use of historical narratives, which are often constructed in intertextual ways, is central to their claims to legitimacy and power in the present. They may, in current times, for example, be closely allied to the ruling party's interests, as one famous local chief very clearly is. They will often also represent the interests of particular social groups, at times, though not always, elder, male, and autochthonous. How should those kinds of questions affect the interpretation of their narratives in your work? At another level, I wondered at the effects of your use of the category of Shona, which you acknowledge as a recent invention, but used throughout the book as a cultural and linguistic category, perhaps a kind of shorthand, with historical meaning. What effect does doing so have in terms of the ethnic politics of the present? What erasures or exclusions are enacted? And what happens to the symbolic and political relationship of the nation as a whole to Great Zimbabwe? There are also, rarely but occasionally, quite striking analogies suggested between a reclaimed Great Zimbabwe and Zimbabwe today. For example, in the emphasis on the accountability and egalitarianism of Great Zimbabwe's kings and the importance of local production as opposed to trade in exotics, views which are set adjacent to a comment on political elites now who extravagantly consume things they do not produce and rely on external sources of money and goods. So I wondered if you would also reflect on whether and how your relationship to Zimbabwean politics in the present influences your interpretations of it.
I don't belong to any political party.
But you have views. Finally,
non-aligned movement.
you can claim that, but yeah. Anyway, let me one last thing, which is to return to the book's goal of rendering narratives about Great Zimbabwe locally understandable. I just wondered if you could elaborate on how those narratives are actually made accessible in practical terms, how they're returned, how they're restored, through involving local people in the research itself, through community meetings, through displays and signs at the site, or other forms of engagement. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on what you found most effective and rewarding and sustainable in that regard. Okay, so that's my comments. And now I'm going to introduce Professor William Barnard, and he's going to give his, many of you I'm sure know Professor William Barnard. He's the Emeritus Professor at St. Antony's College and formerly the Professor of Race Relations. He was the Director of the African Studies Center and Chair of the Editorial Board of the Journal of Southern African Studies. He's played a huge role in establishing African studies in this university. He's published so many books, I don't even know if I can list them all, but they include 20th Century South Africa, The Rise of Conservation in South Africa, Environment and Empire, Prickly Pear, African Local Knowledge, Rights to Land, and The Scientific Imagination in South Africa, 1700 to the present, many of those co-authored. Obviously, lots of those topics are directly relevant to the subjects of this book, so we'll look forward to hearing your comments now.
Thank you very much. It's a book that works on a number of different levels. Firstly, it's an excellent overview of the archaeological work of Great Zimbabwe, and I think that I haven't seen so dense and complete a review of that. And then secondly, it's a history of the writing about Great Zimbabwe. And then thirdly, it's perhaps centrally an argument, as Joss has emphasized, supported by detailed material to reconceptualize and decolonize the history and archaeology more broadly. And it does this through examining the local context and through trying to use the concepts and language of African societies, let's call them Shona. It's tightly written. There's an extensive and very valuable bibliography, and so it's going to be essential reading, not only for Great Zimbabwe, but for archaeological and historical approaches to African societies more generally and more broadly. So Shadrach argues that although archaeologists understood Great Zimbabwe to be an African creation from the 1930s at least, and made progress in describing it, they continued to use colonial concepts and language and powers, in a sense, even after the Zimbabwean independence in 1980. By contrast, he argues that, quote, native concepts must be placed at the front and center of knowledge production in order to Africanize. And this requires a combination of Shona concepts with archaeological methods to develop a, quote, native-centered interpretation. And many of the elements of this argument are developed through the book. I can't, well, you'll have to ask him more about them, perhaps. Concepts of land and territory, of time, one of the most interesting excursions, and of spirituality. It's a particularly challenging approach. And one of the indicators or ideas that he has is to consider Great Zimbabwe not as a monument or as a city, though it may have been a variation of the many forms of pre-colonial cities that there were, but as a constellation of homesteads. And it should be analyzed first from that perspective and not as a monument. So the latter, the monument, was of course why it stood out for generations of visitors, especially white. But he wants to root the site and the settlement in its local context. And from this, I think, build a range of different insights to do with language and concept, but also, for example, to undermine a simplistic view of the rise and fall, the fall happening around 1450 in some versions. Because settlement and culture persisted, the term resilience comes up a good deal. It's also linked to an argument for seeing continuity in concepts and language. And in my understanding, that leads to an alternative approach to causation in what I think is both challenging and maybe controversial. So, yes, and he argues for the causation of the rise and the disputed fall as an interaction of multiple variables, which I think is now a very widespread approach in historical work. Moving away from ideas about trade and external factors to look internally, and he proposes, or at least I understand him to propose, an essentially religious or spiritual argument at the end of the book, so that the territory and site are the abode of ancestral spirits and an integral part of people's belonging. And this makes ideology an important lens to look at the rise of the social formation associated with groups now known as Shona. So he posits or suggests that it may have had its roots in a special religious power, and this rather than any external trade connections or military, and the formation of potentially a religious elite who converted their position into political power may be a more useful way of thinking about the history of the site. That, I think, is fascinating, challenging to me as a more materialist historian, and I'd like to try to debate it. So I learned a great deal from this challenging book, and it opens up, as a good book should, many exciting and interesting points. Just 3, because there's not much time. The first is, I understand Shadrach to be shifting the focus, which perhaps dominated the earlier archaeological work, from the more exotic global or Indian Ocean trade and the objects that came into Great Zimbabwe and were found there, to a focus on the metallurgy. In other words, how do we understand the site in relation not only to sites where minerals existed fairly nearby, but somewhere that you can see a regional social geography of this part of Africa through understanding which metal objects were coming in and where, say, iron came from. And I'd like him to talk more about that. It's something that particularly because this is his main field, that excites me, because it's talking not only about objects and routes of analyzing old objects, but also to rethink migration of people with metals and social connections. Secondly, the emphasis on clayworking and other crafts in the homestead base leads for me into a gendered discussion of work, which is mentioned, and even potentially power. So I'd be very interested in hearing how we deal with this and think of pre-colonial Africa outside of a more patriarchal lens. But I also wanted to ask about the walls, which you discuss effectively and now are known in a very wide swathe of the eastern side of southern Africa. For example, recent work on Bakoni and Mpumalanga in South Africa, where they're not the same ceremonial, let's call them ceremonial structures on such a scale, but extensive stone walling, which you also find in the Zimbabwean sites. And ask who provided the labor. Were women as well as men, and was this indication of a hierarchical society? And you do put an emphasis also on maintenance. And the third, and here I come to Joss's points as well at the end, I thought that the initial argument for integrating local knowledge and scientific archaeology was convincingly stated, but that the latter got a bit lost in the plea for the former. Now, I understand it because it's a book, it's an argument which you're trying to make, and I think do make consistently throughout the book on dealing with various. But I thought that scientific archaeology got a little bit lost, and that we should also ask about the limits of local knowledge and contemporary language in reconstructing a site and the surrounding region of this kind. And then just very lastly, who owns it? And at the beginning, and I didn't see it really followed up, you mentioned spirit mediums wanting to hold ceremonies, and it sort of reminded me of druids in Stonehenge. And should they or shouldn't they be allowed? Who owns this? And does the state, is it an African monument, as of course it's often in a way claimed to be? And does the local state or even international protective or organized, do they have a role in trying to control or protect? Thank you.
Thank you, William. That's loads of questions for you. So you now get the floor to respond as you want, and then we'll have a discussion for a little while.
No, thank you so much. I wish I had talked to you guys before writing. then the outcome would have been different. And also the good thing about being asked too many questions is that my mother told me to choose this one. so you go for the easier one. And for the difficult stuff, you just but on a more serious note, if you feel that there are some questions that I have not addressed, do please remind me. So let me start from one of the points that William made, and which also resonate with what Josh said in terms of the local knowledge. The one challenge that I grappled with, and I don't think that I have a solution, but maybe since you said that you are an oral historian, you can help a friend out here. So the main challenge is that how do you deal with a situation where the major dominant form of literacy was oral literacy? So transmission of information by a word of mouth from generation to generation. So oral sources, oral traditions, right? Then written literacy came in the late 19th century, early 20th century, right? So that written literacy, in some cases, was based on recording some of those traditions, right? So as more and more people went to school, they would also read from these books, right? So now, in the 21st century, if you go to the communities around Great Zimbabwe and ask them what they know from their traditions, they are going to give you what they read from books. So there's that feedback process between the oral and the written, and the oral. How do we disentangle that? Because some of the myths that I don't think I had managed to resolve that. That was a challenge which I grappled with, and which also speaks to notions of power and the politics of the local. Who defines the local, right? And how do you define it? So is local based on proximity, that if you live, if your house is adjacent to Great Zimbabwe, then you are local? Or is local defined by some form of ancestry, that you can say that my ancestors are associated with the Great Zimbabwe? And there's also contestation that particularly on some of the earlier migrationist arguments, that Great Zimbabwe was abandoned in 1450 and that was an empty landscape. So the people who are there now, their ancestors only arrived in the 18th century or even in the 19th century. So what that does, it says that everyone that is local should have no claim whatsoever or association with the Great Zimbabwe, except that they are close to Great Zimbabwe. So that then becomes a highly contested terrain. Just you might be aware that last year in April there was a spirit medium who, in the company of some of the top Zimbabwean archaeologists, went to perform some excavations at Great Zimbabwe. So spirit medium-led archaeology. So what this spirit medium was saying was that he had visions from the ancestors, and he needed to go and retrieve something from that burial, something that is spiritual. So, and said, the archaeologists, can you come? So you excavate using your techniques, but when we get to what I'm looking for, I will tell you what that is. So they dug for about 3 meters, and then the spirit medium just picked the 2 lumps of soil and said, there it is. That's my ancestor. I was looking for him. Right. That then becomes very interesting, because this spirit medium is not from, on the basis of proximity, is not from an area that is close to Great Zimbabwe. Is coming from an area which is around at least 200 kilometers away. Right? So the local spirit mediums, they are not being given access. Right? So your point about whoever is linked to the politicians has access to Great Zimbabwe, except me.
You're outside politics.
Yes, because you might be asking, so how do you get the permit to dig at Great Zimbabwe? Are you also part of them? No. So that just shows that Great Zimbabwe is indeed a highly contested place. But even within that, as scholars, and Just Fontaine has made this argument at some point, how do we ensure that these people who are outside power, how do we represent their stories? How do we capture them? How do we ensure that we use them to inform whatever we are doing with the Great Zimbabwe? So that was one of my major aims. So, and one of the activities that we have been doing is in terms of rebuilding the walls of Great Zimbabwe, because sometimes they collapse. And as a maintenance, as a restoration measure, we rebuild them using a traditional or the skills and knowledge of masonry, which is held by the communities. So we have rebuilt some, and in doing that, we are guided by the local folks, and they tell us they lead the whole enterprise, and they tell us that, here let us do this, here let us do that, and we have this very, very, very nice and collaborative engagement. But even that may not be enough, because about 3-4 weeks ago I was at Great Zimbabwe, and they were asking me that what happened to the information that came from our previous work. Don't you think that we also deserve to at least know what we found, or we must also be part of those stories? So in that way, then I'm also constrained by my tools as an academic, that the extractivism, that we just go and extract, and then we go to Cape Town, we go to Harare, we go to Oxford, and then we share the results, but we forget those people. So would it have been different if I had written this book in Shona and approached Joss and said, hey, my friend, can you please translate this? Would it have been different? those are also some of the things that I could not resolve. And maybe at some point I will try and write. I will try and write in Shona, which, as William pointed out, as just also pointed out, the very name Shona is a label that was invented in the late 19th century. Before then, different groups were known by different names. So the good thing that it does is that when you say Shona, you are homogenizing.
You're also
Right.
excluding
No, who are you excluding?
people who aren't labeled Shona.
Well, because, okay, that's fine. Maybe she might say, because I'm also part of that group, I'm also Shona, right? But here is my argument. So by the very label Shona is an envelope which houses at least 5, 6, or 7 different ethnicities, right? So you have the Zulu, Karanga, Ndau, and so on, right? So the terms of the ethnic politics, even right now in the politics of Zimbabwe, right? There are some commentators who accuse those who are in power of just favoring the Southerners because they are Karanga, right? The former president Mugabe was Zulu, so it was. So when you talk of Shona, isn't that a way of? I know I'm sounding utopian, but isn't that a way of homogenizing everything? Well, debatable, I know, and particularly when it comes to Zimbabwe, also have other groups or other peoples that are not Shona, for example, the Ndebele, and also Shangan, and there are also Tonga people, and there are also other groups. So if we don't refer to these groups as Shona, we refer to them as Zulu, and so on. With what result, and with what complications, right? So, is there a way of writing the past in a way where we can say whatever label we use, at least these people can relate to the past that we are producing? So that's why, William, I was running away from describing, the incandescence of hot gas molecules. Or balancing those stoichiometry or some of those scientific principles. What I was more interested in is relatability. How do we make this past something that people can engage with? So the other point that I wouldn't say political, but what I was trying to do is to correct a narrative that for which in contemporary times it might be read as follows: for Africa to develop, it needs foreign aid, right? And it needs external consultants. Why? Because even in the past, they did not produce anything. They were importing finished manufactured goods from the Indian Ocean, glass beads and everything else. And they were giving away their gold, and they were giving away all their raw materials. So it's raw materials, right? It's not even considered that there was some intellectual capital that was invested in some of those commodities that were exported to the Indian Ocean. So in other words, Africa had no knowledge. What it simply did is you grab the gold is a noble metal anyway. What you don't is not like iron, which you need the reduction and so on. It's just gold. It's So you wash it through density separation. You get your gold dust, you melt it, and then you ship it off to the Indian Ocean. So what is the order of the day today? Export all your gold. Right? So that you can support your balance of payments. But was it the case? If we look at the material evidence from places, from Great Zimbabwe, what do we see? We see evidence of production. We see crucibles, we see remnants of finished products. We also see that the people are consuming the gold, right? Nowadays, you just mine the gold, you ship it, all of it. You mine the diamonds, you don't even have money to buy them. You ship all of them. But there is the evidence that people are at least consuming some of these resources. So, coming to the question that you raised, William, what I'm interested in is applying the tools of science to reconstruct the local and the regional economy. And one of the commodities that I'm looking at the moment is copper, because the chemical composition and the isotopic composition of processed copper metal, it inherits some of the elements and isotopes from the parent ore, right? So and that is not affected by smelting or processing of the metal. So there is a genetic relationship between the ore body and the metal, the finished metal. So if you apply isotopic techniques, you are able to predict, or at least to guess, the source of the copper. So we are able to identify patterns of trade from the modern day Lubumbashi region, Katanga in the DRC, in northern Zambia, and in other places. So and we can also see when they are mixing copper from south of the Limpopo, so Palaborwa, Musina, and also from the north, and some of the mines around. So that is also giving us some idea that there was this local production that was taking place. So if the people at Great Zimbabwe were having their production, and they were also exchanging with China, there are also some of those Chinese objects which were recovered from Great Zimbabwe, and some of which are 800 years old and so on. Nowadays, we complain that Chinese things don't last. Why don't we learn from these guys? That you can, when in these trade and exchange relationships, you can buy things that last longer. Just a good lesson in diplomacy. I don't think that was political. But the final point about the stone walls. Yes, the stone walls are quite pervasive. In fact, from southern Angola right up to Mozambique, you find these dry stone walls. And even if you go to Kenya, you will also find these dry stone walls, and to Cameroon, and so on. So what is special about Great Zimbabwe? Why is it so distinctive about that? That's where the politics of knowledge production, stone is a raw material. And you use what is around you, don't you? That's why people are building in this stone. But when knowledge was constructed in the late 19th century, Great Zimbabwe and related settlements, there was this exceptionalism. This is the best there is. So there are, at least depending on how you count, more than 500, 600 settlements that look like Great Zimbabwe. So Great Zimbabwe is called great because it is the biggest. But it is not there are many others. So what would have happened if people had simply said, they looking at the settlements that are built of stone, there are so many of them, and then there's no need to just make this great one exceptional? What would have happened? It would be perhaps ordinary. It would be, I'm not trying to belittle Great Zimbabwe. It's an extraordinary place. But all I am saying is that the way in which we construct knowledge, and also Great Zimbabwe was even made a monument, right? And it's now a World Heritage Site. And it also gave its name to the country that is now Zimbabwe. So I want to end on a lighter note, just to say that one of the jokes is that Great Zimbabwe is built of dry stone walling. So that is using the precise placement method without any binders such as mortar or cement. And the highest walls are 11 meters. So that's the the outer curtain wall of the great enclosure. So these days in Zimbabwe, they say that there's a problem with corruption. So some people say, okay, maybe corruption also started during the time of Great Zimbabwe, because the people who were given money to buy mortar and cement just said, yeah, how about if we use the money and just take these, these stones one on top of the other. Whether there's any truth or not in it, well, Great Zimbabwe is a stunning place. Let me end here.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether we should respond or we should allow questions from the audience, because I don't want to exclude the audience. So why don't we see if anyone has questions from any of you, and then William and I can jump in if not, or later on.
All of that. and linguistics would also. So praise poetry is a very powerful tool, because it has political and social geography and toponyms. So they, in terms of depending on what one's totem is, they mention the different places where they were living. So, for example, some of the people associated with groups such as the Roji, they talk of Tabaskamambo, Manyanga, and all these other places where they had been. So that is also very, very, very helpful. But we have been very slow to take advantage of those riches, because some of the conventional approaches were molded in a way which privileged scientific reasoning. So you have to come up with a hypothesis, test that hypothesis with data, come up with the general laws, and then generalize to everywhere. So that approach, perhaps that's the one that persuaded me to write this book, actually, because I was just, I said, no, this doesn't really work. And some of that knowledge was also challenged for being inferior. Remember, in terms of scientific terms, the argument is always that theories that explain the most data are the most useful. So if praise poetry can only tell us about how people moved back and forth from southern Angola to southwestern Zambia, then we ignore that, because it doesn't tell us about all the other things. So that's part of the thinking that we need to disrupt, and bringing into the conversation all the different knowledges, so that at least the end result would be much more productive and much more locally empowering, with the difficulties of defining what local is and what empowering is.
Can I jump in as an oral historian? I suppose, listening to you, I keep thinking there's an idea that there's some sort of pure version of the history that can be accessed. And perhaps I didn't express what I was trying to say clearly enough, but the idea that the history, there is no point where history is not affected by power relations. There is no point in which knowledge is produced without politics. So in Great Zimbabwe in 1300, the stories told about the past then would have represented various political agendas held by certain groups within that community. There wasn't a community with a view. So that's why I'm kind of disturbed by phrases like, there is a Shona view on X, because there's never one. It's always going to be contested. It's always going to be power-laden. So it's not like you could go back and find the pure version through getting a better and better and a better technique of research, either through science or through linguistics or through praise poems. And there's so many wonderful things actually been done with praise poems, but they are praise poems. They're literally about praising powerful people. So they're totally distorted, accounts of what's happening. By definition, that's what's interesting about them, is the role they play socially. But yeah, so anyway, so that's my point, is that there is no version of knowledge production that is without politics, whether it's local or whether it's archaeological or whether it's oral history or whether it's whatever it is. We're all having to contend constantly with that set of challenges. And you reminded me with your story about the spirit medium going and finding things at Great Zimbabwe. Your colleague, who I'm sure you know well, Njabulo Chipengura, did an article for us in JSS on his contention with spirit mediums at a mass grave exhumation. And he was outraged by their intervention, partly because they were very much allied to the ruling party and allied to veteran organizations who had a particular agenda. In his point of view, they were absolutely subservient to that agenda. But he was also outraged because their intervention hid from the living relatives of the people who were buried there the possibility of identifying the dead. So he saw it as ethically incredibly problematic to bring in that particular kind of knowledge and to claim knowledge on that basis in that context. So I think it has weighty, effects, these kinds of things. It's not just like one versus another way of approaching these things. I know you know all of that. I'm just reiterating it.
So the moral of the story is that we must be political. Yay!
But political, not like supporting the ruling party. Political is understanding that, power is integral to every story that we tell. Yeah. But I mean, this is one of the incredibly glorious things about your book, is that it does that really explicitly. And incredibly relentlessly through the whole book, as you address, one set of questions after another. You're really engaging all of that, and that's why I love this book. It's fantastic.
Could I come in on something completely different, except that it relates to power, and that if you stand back now from your immersion for so long, do you see Great Zimbabwe and this broader territory, Nika, around it as a peaceable kingdom? It's striking that there isn't much in the book about military, and there is so often, I expect, in archaeological remains some kind of military element, whether, walls often mean military in other aspects, or iron means weapons, but here it's gongs. And of course, it's intriguing that the Shona, let's call them that, were seen as such until they rebelled, it's true, in 1896 by visitors and colonial powers to a greater extent as not being particularly military oriented. And the concepts that you're using seem to me to have a kind of spiritual or emphasis. So I'm just asking you to stand back and think if there is potentially a kind of comparison across a range of archaeologically identified societies that, yeah.
I hope you don't want us to talk about the military coup of 2017.
No, you're getting very political.
Because that's the military playing an important role in social and every aspect of life. I mean, apologies for that trivia, but yes, the in terms of administration, in terms of the military, and their contribution to territorial expansion, territorial integrity, and so on. It's something that did cross my mind, and of course, some of the material remains from Great Zimbabwe include spearheads, arrowheads, and similar kinds of things that would have been used in battle and so on. But the challenge then is that if you just there are also some spears and arrows which were also kept for symbolic purposes. So then if you excavate a spearhead how do you know that this was just for symbolic purposes? Yeah, you might maybe look into do some metallography studies and then examine the quality of the iron, and then maybe for utilitarian objects, the quality might be better than for symbolic objects. Bill Dewey and Terry Childs did a similar study like that, maybe nearly 30 years ago. But other than that, it's purely speculative, and you might say that's what archaeology is all about. But yeah, I think one could make an argument around the presence of weaponry, and think about the military and how it would have been important in terms of expanding territory or protecting territory. But I would have struggled to find a lot of words in terms of expanding that and demonstrating how that would work in practice. Partly because of what you mentioned earlier, these romanticized views that the groups of people that are now incorrectly known as Shona, they never fought anyone, the most peaceful people ever, and they never got angry and so on, very, 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 very peace-loving people.
As if the Liberation War didn't happen, it's quite bizarre.
Yeah, well, the Liberation War, well, it was. I mean, we know the works of Norma Krieger and others, particularly in terms of the violence associated with that. But well, that's not the important period. We are talking of the pre-colonial period. So something happened. Maybe it was socialism or capitalism that affected the comrades, But anyway, it's a different context and a different time period. But also, of course, it depends on the one's orientation. Of course, violence would have been there, and of course, the inequality would have been there, and class struggles would also have been there. But just that some of the tools that we use, they do not allow us to reconstruct that with the resolution of an oral historian. For example, then the questions Barbara will say, how do you know? that kind of thing. But maybe something that we need to venture into, and then see what the response is like.
I think we're past time, so I should wrap up. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you to Shadrach, and congratulations on your book. I think we should